Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well, doing well. We spotted an article this morning, what we thought was of interest in the American conservative, by a Jonathan Asconis. And he touched on a subject that we found fascinating because we've talked about it before.
And we agree with him.
Yeah, that's it. No arguments here. But let me just read the title to his article, and it tells you what this subject is all about. His title is How the Pentagon Budget is a Threat to the Middle Class. Yeah. And that is so appropriate now because it's the wiping out of the middle class that is a big subject in the election now. But it's capitalism that's threatening the middle class, according to the socialists. Yeah. But anyway, he makes the point, you know, that there's a myth that floats around about military spending. And I have heard it in recent years. You know, people that you think are smarter than this say, you know, if things turn down, one of the best things you can do is have a war.
Yeah.
People have known that, and that's how Roosevelt really finally got us out of the Depression. We had World War II. Yeah, everybody was employed, but they were getting killed. Yeah. You know, and everybody was getting poorer. So yes, that's a myth that's been around a long time. But he gets into this in detail and showed that the middle class really isn't helped. And of course, our argument has always been they're the ones who pay for it. Yeah. In a literal way, you know, financially and their jobs and loss of life and disruption in their life. So this whole idea that it's good for jobs, the one thing that you do have to concede is it is good for some jobs. If you happen to be getting a union paid job in the military industrial complex, and then you do quite well. But the whole thing is, if you have money there and a few people benefit, it has to come from someplace else. And that's why the first thought that came to my mind when I read this article was Henry Hazlitt. Yeah, this sounds good. It's right. There is a little bit of help for this narrow group. But instead of what? And that's his whole economic point in his little pamphlet, instead of what? Because you have to look at how the money might have been spent if the government hadn't taken it or told people how to spend it or tax or whatever. Maybe it could have been used for more productive purposes. And obviously our philosophic argument is that we think what people earn is theirs, and they should have the opportunity to waste it or spend it wisely or save it or whatever, because government is incapable of doing it. No matter how many lies they tell, they are incapable of managing the personal finances of the people. And of course, the other point that we can talk about is that this is not and should not be a threat to national security, because that's the other argument. You're not allowed to say a word, because this is national security. We need to fight these wars. We need to protect the freedom of the American people. We need to protect the Constitution. We need to be patriotic Americans. We need to support the troops. All this garbage that they argue, that just isn't true. And yet there's no reason why you have to give up the notion that a country has a right and a moral obligation to defend itself. But that's not what all this money is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Professor Asconis, he's over at Catholic University. He's also a fellow at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship, and that was actually founded by our good friend Klaus Renn, who's also on the board of the Ron Paul Institute. So, you know, 3 cheers for what they're doing over there. But it's an interesting piece, and it caught our attention. And of course, we didn't see eye to eye on every single point he made, but that's fine. But what he wrote was really a response to a piece in Bloomberg by a professor from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. It was titled, "Progressives Should Learn to Love the Pentagon Budget." So this is what the professor at SAIS said. And the argument that he made is that the military, our huge budget, is a real twofer. You know, it's, first of all, it keeps the global liberal order led by the U.S. intact. It keeps things intact. And second, it creates a lot of great jobs machine for the middle class and middle America. And that's what Asconis is arguing against, and he's pointing out that it's totally wrong. And here's his thesis: American military adventurism and massive spending undermines the middle class and makes the world less free and less safe. And I think that is something that you've been saying for a long time.
Right, and it brings up the subject of how people were thinking about this issue during the 1960s. Economic conditions weren't perfect, but they weren't like they were in the 70s. They were spending a lot of money on the military, which gives a boost to a certain group of people. And then also there was the introduction of the safety net, the welfare state. So guns and butter, that's good. And people love it, and the politician liked it. Johnson won an election overwhelmingly arguing that case. He also lost it too because it wasn't working. But they argued then that you could have both, but what they don't want to talk about, and what we don't want to talk about today, is that the arrogance of it all means that yes, we want to spend the money, but we have to be very, very cautious about taxing the middle class. You just can't, drain the middle class. They'd revolt against us. So we have to get it out of the middle class by inflating and run up the debt and print the money and put the penalty, on the middle class. And of course, that was why by the beginning of the 1970s, 1971, they say we can't be restrained in printing the money because that is the tax. We print the money, it dilutes the value of the money, and guess what? The middle class suffers the most. And they're still suffering from this. I mean, the real wages don't go up, but it introduces another crazy notion. You recognize, yeah, this is true. The socialists are arguing. They're behind. The real wage has not gone up, and that's why we have to redistribute wealth and set wages and do all this nonsense, because they won't consider the fact that the real wage is down because they're getting paid by depreciating money. So it has a lot of ramification, not only the negative ramifications of not accomplishing what they want to do instead of making us safer and secure and protecting our liberties. It's during these periods of time, just think in this century so far, the military spending has skyrocketed, but what has been really diminished are our civil liberties here at home. And that's a cost that probably is hardly ever mentioned. And you can go back all the way to the Civil War and find out that especially during wartime, civil liberties mean nothing because you cannot challenge the president. They can disobey the law. And just think of what's happened here in the last 10, 15 years about the loss of privacy in this country. But it's this attitude that the Pentagon and the military spending is a panacea. Yeah. It happens to be wrong, but the people immediately are going to say, you guys don't care about national defense. Well, I'll tell you what, if we totally bankrupt this country and undermine our worldwide position, which we're doing, just because we have more nuclear bombs at this particular moment, doesn't mean that we're going to be the safest and most secure country.
And it really is disturbing because the original article that's, I think, pretty successfully debunked in the American Conservative is basically we have to turn progressives pro-war because it provides a wonderful social safety net for people. See, all the things you want, all this welfare, it's provided. You just have to, embrace the warfare state. And it's dangerous. The original article that was debunked by the SAIS professor was that, an average guy in Ohio, there's a lot of good middle-class jobs in Ohio that come from the National Guard. They get some supplemental pay. Well, why do they need supplemental pay? Their regular jobs must not be paying enough, right? There's one thing. They get some assistance for college. Well, why is college so doggone expensive? That's another thing. And they get some help with insurance. And that all goes back to how you started, in place of what, instead of what. So they're having to supplement their bad salaries, their bad living standards. And I think the professor points out that the middle class is $40,000, middle class families $40,000 poorer than it was just 10 years ago in 2008. So they're having to join the National Guard to make up this money that they're actually losing. How is that a net benefit?
And this for a moment concede that everybody has the same concern about the people in the middle class and everybody wants people to do well, which is pretty much the case, but they're weighted down by bad ideas. Their deficits don't matter. You just print the money in order to help the people out. But I think the bottom line is, and the question that should be asked is, earnings and savings and caring for oneself has existed for thousands of years, just how it's done by individuals or governments or families or whatever. But right now the argument is the spending and the caring for the middle class. Is this a government responsibility or is it a personal responsibility? And there's a lot of people in limbo on this. There's quite a few, I think, understand exactly what the market is all about and why earnings one's own keep and spending it and taking care of it versus, oh, the government will take care of us. A lot of people say, yeah, they take care of us. They send me food stamps, they give me an apartment, and we get free education, all these kind of things. So they're quite satisfied with it. But what they don't want to look at is the consequence, like the 70s were a definite consequence of the 60s, and what we're going through ever since, ups and downs, is the destruction of the middle class. Even in spite of this wonderful, wonderful recovery, I think when the dust is settled and it's studied, the real wages didn't go up, and that's why some of the way out progressives have traction, is because there is some merit to their argument that people aren't doing well and we need to help them out. So one way that they want, that they think they can help out, and that's what this article addresses, is do we really help the middle class, by war? And the answer should be absolutely not. It's a drain and a penalty on the middle class, and that's the way it's always been.
And look how it reflects economic decline, because it wasn't that many years ago that we talked about the military being a poverty draft. You know, the people that are impoverished, they can't find any work at all. They don't have very many skills. They're forced to go into the military because that's the only way they can make a couple of bucks. That's now progressed into a middle class draft. So there are people that were in the middle class that are having to supplement their income by joining the military or by joining the National Guard or an adjunct. But look about the cost to families, and you've talked about this a lot. Say this Ohio people that we're talking about that are in the National Guard, they're deployed off to war. What does that do to families? Divorce rates, problems with PTSD and other things, how it destroys a family. And then you have people like, you remember the quote, Madeleine Albright, what's good's having this great military if you don't use it? People that aren't going to themselves be shot up, they're going to be more likely. We got all these guys in Ohio getting all this money. Why don't we send them off and get them all shot up? I mean, is going overseas and getting shot up, is that what it means to be a middle-class American?
And you know, this movement on to praise the military, this super patriotism, thank you for your service, on, and give the benefits, is to enforce this whole principle that this is not only good for national defense and patriotism, it is good, for the entire country and our freedom to have this program of using the military for no limits. Yeah. And here you get the conservatives, as a matter of fact, they're the champions of this most of the time. Even though there are supporters on both sides for a little bit of restraint, the bigger spenders for military is on the Republican side. And of course, ultimately, the deep state controls the big issues, whether you have printing press money or whether you have an interventionist foreign policy for various reasons, or whether you have done this on its own. It's done for the very good purpose of saying that one of the most patriotic jobs anybody could ever have in this day and age is just join the military and sacrifice yourself. So that to me, I think is not an accident. I think that is just a purposeful way of getting people to never challenge the military spending. When is the last time that we found a real cut in military spending? It's been a long time.
The sequester, right? That's when they promised they would cut it, and then they just
but then they didn't follow it and put it into another fund.
Another fund. My only small quibble with the professor's piece, and I think it was a good piece, and probably because we agreed with it, but I had a slight quibble because he criticizes the military filling in on tasks that should be undertaken by diplomacy. And he points out that the military is getting this bloated budget, while places like the State Department might not be fully topped up with the funding that they need. I think he slightly misses the point, though, and this is particularly true under Hillary Clinton, but I think the process started before then, which is the militarization of U.S. diplomacy. So giving more to state is not going to be a less militaristic foreign policy, because we've already militarized our diplomacy. I was just looking at a press briefing from the senior State Department policy advisor and the special representative for Iran, Brian Hook. There's a guy at the State Department, should be doing diplomacy. He goes up there and he gives a briefing on how fantastic the sanctions are against Iran because they've destroyed their economy, bringing them to their knees, making life miserable for the Iranians. We're taking them down. We're destroying their country. And this is diplomacy, you know. So there is a slight kind of overemphasis on diplomacy, and diplomacy as it exists right now in the State Department is just an adjunct of the military.
Yeah, and I think this reflects the notion that interventionism is okay, and we take a position which is very strongly anti-intervention without conceding that you have to be an isolationist, that you're exactly the opposite. And the diplomacy is to be there not to be militarized, but actually to how do we do better in communications and travel and getting rid of regulations and sanctions, instead of the State Department and the Pentagon participating in, we will bring, the Iranians to their heels, bring them down, and we will put on the sanctions. And that, of course, is not a good diplomacy. One time in a debate, presidential debate, this issue was coming up on how it happened. And I said, we have enough diplomats. Why don't we use a couple of them, in a positive way? That's really what we need. But it's sort of like economic intervention. Everybody is an economic interventionist, essentially. It's just, well, I want to intervene here, and you here, but they endorse the principle. So we have our diplomats around the world, and I had a relative that worked at an embassy one time, and you may even have some personal experience with that. In the embassies, they said, the CIA was, all over there, and business people were all over there. It was just an extension of our corporatism, because we haven't even talked about that, but corporatism is very much involved here too. This so-called build this up. This is good for jobs and good for the middle class, but it's good for corporations too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would close out by just revisiting a couple of things. I'm pretty excited about how things are going for the Ron Paul Institute. We've got a conference coming up next month on May 18th here in Houston. You go to the Ron Paul Institute website and you'll find out about it. But yesterday I held up your book and I said, this is the only place you can get it. Join the Ron Paul Institute. For $50 or more, you'll get a copy of this book. For $100 or more, you'll get a signed copy of this book. I mean, this is something for the to hold on to. The response, Dr. Paul, has been really good so far. It's only good for the month of May. We're only going to be able to do this for May, and we have a limited number of copies. But we need to raise a little bit of money to keep the show on the road, to keep the conferences coming. We've got one in August, too, that we'll talk about. But we need a little bit of money. We need your support, and we want to give you something to say thank you. This is the best thing you'll read all year, trust me. So go to ronpaulinstitute.org/support to make your donation. It'll automatically show up. We'll know you did it, even if you don't hear from us right away, that you'll get the book. So don't worry. Join us, and thanks very much.
Very good. And I want to close by just emphasizing the point about why and how the middle class gets the penalty from an interventionist foreign policy. Because it's very, very expensive, and we can't deny the expenses, it is said, because it's a patriotic duty, and we have to spread American exceptionalism, and they give you all these wonderful reasons why we have to do it. And we will pretend that the middle class does not suffer, and we will take care of course, the military, so nobody ever questions any military spending. The one thing that I work on over the years, and I think people should think about it, we should not be talking about the Defense Department, the defense spending. This has nothing to do with defense. Matter of fact, it undermines our defense. What we wanted to talk about is militarism and the military budget, and that it involves a lot of money and a lot of borrowing, a lot of debt, and that falls on the middle class. The wealthy actually can, in the last 20 years, even in less years, the wealthier are becoming wealthier day by day, because there is so much economic interventionism, and a lot of it is through the militarization of what we do, pretending that, oh, this is, like some people claim, this is good for the middle class. This will take care of it, and war is good for the economy. That's a bunch of nonsense. The only thing that's good for the middle class and good for the economy is peace, and concentrating on the protection of personal liberty. Now that will help the middle class. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.